It was supposed to be a normal afternoon, a visit to see my son, maybe share lunch, talk about the garden. But when he opened the door, his eyes were colder than winter. Behind him, his wife stood with her arms folded, like a wall between us. He said 5 words that split the air. Please, just leave us alone. No anger, just finality. I stood there, holding the bag of groceries I'd brought, and realized something had died quietly. Not family, but respect. I left without a word. The next morning, he learned what silence can bring to court. It was late afternoon when I walked up the driveway, the same path I'd taken for years, carrying gifts, casseroles, and love. The garden looked different, trimmed, lifeless, too perfect. The kind of order that only comes when warmth has been replaced by rules. I rang the bell, and when the door opened, my son stood there like a stranger wearing my boy's face. His shoulders stiff, eyes tired but cold. Behind him, his wife leaned against the wall, watching, arms crossed. The moment felt rehearsed, like they'd decided what to say before I arrived. He opened the door halfway, just enough for politeness but not enough for welcome. I smiled anyway, holding the small box of pastries I'd baked, but his face didn't change. Please, just leave us alone, he said. Calm, measured, cutting. Not shouted, not cruel in tone, but final in weight. The kind of sentence that closes a chapter. I stood there for a second, the air between us heavy with something I couldn't fix. His wife didn't move. She just stared at me as though waiting to see what I'd do. For a moment, I thought I might drop the pastries, but I didn't. I just nodded, turned around, and walked back to my car. Every step felt longer than the last. The gravel crunched under my shoes, echoing louder than their silence. I didn't look back because I knew if I did, I'd see the door close. Not just the wooden one, but every door that had ever existed between us. I sat in the car, hands on the steering wheel, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I wasn't crying. I was remembering. Remembering every sacrifice that had built that man's life. The nights I skipped dinner so he could eat. The mornings I walked to work in the rain to pay his tuition. The house that still had my name on the papers. He told me to leave them alone. He thought that meant I'd stay quiet. What he didn't realize was that his words didn't break me. They freed me. I drove home that day in complete silence, my mind already making decisions he'd never expect. Love can turn into something sharp when pushed too far. I didn't need to yell or beg. I didn't need to explain my worth to a son who'd forgotten it. When I got home, I didn't go to my room. I went straight to the study, to the drawer where I kept the old folder with every document that tied me to the home he called his own. I placed it on the table, brushed off the dust, and stared at it for a long time. That folder had been untouched for years. It contained everything: deeds, signatures, contracts, records of payments I had made, the proof that I wasn't just a visitor in his life, but the foundation of it. The house was quiet, just like I liked it. I made a cup of tea, sat down, and opened the folder slowly. Each page reminded me that love without respect has a cost. I realized I had spent my entire life trying to protect him from the world, but I had never once protected myself from him. Until now. When I lay in bed that night, I wasn't sad anymore. I was calm. I had made peace with something most parents never do. That blood doesn't always mean loyalty. And kindness doesn't always mean safety. Some lessons arrive late, but they still arrive. I fell asleep knowing exactly what I would do in the morning. He wanted me gone. He wanted peace. He'd get both. just not the way he imagined. I raised my son with hands that never stopped working. When his father passed suddenly, I didn't get time to grieve. I got bills, responsibilities, and a little boy looking up at me, waiting for answers. I worked in a grocery shop during the day and cleaned offices at night. I told myself it was temporary, that one day I'd rest when he was settled. Every extra hour, every ache in my back was spent on giving him what I never had: security. He was the reason I woke before sunrise and came home after midnight. When he turned 18, I sold my gold bangles, the last gifts my husband ever gave me, to pay his university fees. I remember standing in that pawn shop, pretending not to care about sentiment while my heart cracked quietly. But it felt worth it then. He was going to build a future that would make all my sacrifices meaningful. He studied finance, graduated with honors, and found a job at a good firm. The day he bought his first car, he hugged me tight and said I was his everything. I believed it. I believed that love, once earned through sacrifice, couldn't fade. When he wanted to buy a house years later, I co-signed the mortgage. He couldn't get approval alone, so he needed my name, my record, my savings. I didn't hesitate. That house, the one he would later tell me to stay away from, had my fingerprints all over it. Every wall, every floorboard, every payment had a trace of me. I helped with the down payment, handled insurance, even paid off a few installments when he fell short. He called it his home, but the truth was simpler. It stood because I built it. There was a time he'd visit me every Sunday, bring groceries, fix the light bulbs, ask if I was eating well. Then slowly, things changed. His visits became shorter, his tone less gentle. His wife started managing the conversations, telling me he was busy. I thought maybe I was the one holding on too tightly, so I gave them space. I didn't realize that space was becoming a wall I had unknowingly funded, brick by brick. Still, I never spoke badly of them. I defended him when relatives complained that he never visited. He's busy, I'd say, smiling. He's doing well. I didn't want anyone to think he'd forgotten his mother. Maybe I didn't want to believe it myself. That's the thing about motherhood. You lie to yourself just to keep the pain quiet. I only started seeing the truth after that afternoon at his doorstep. It wasn't just rejection. It was detachment. He wasn't my son anymore. He was someone I'd built and then lost to comfort. He had grown into a man who thought love was weakness and that independence meant cutting away the roots that held him. That night, I looked around my small home and thought about all those years. The loneliness, the sacrifices, the birthdays I skipped, the exhaustion I wore like a badge. I realized everything I had ever done for him was written down somewhere. Not in memories, but in documents, receipts, signatures. Proof that I existed in more than just his past. He thought saying, "Leave us alone," would make me disappear quietly, like an old habit. He didn't know that I had built my life on resilience, not dependence. My silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. I had given him every chance to value me, and he used everyone to test my limits. But the woman he told to leave us alone was the same woman who once fought debt collectors, illness, and loneliness all at once. When I lay in bed that night, I stared at the ceiling and whispered to myself that love without respect ends where it started, in sacrifice. I wasn't going to let mine go unnoticed. If he could forget where he came from, I could remind him where everything began, on paper, in ink, and in the name that still held power. It didn't happen all at once. Betrayal never does. It starts small: a missed call, an excuse about being busy, a tone that changes slightly over time. My son used to call every evening just to ask if I'd eaten. Then it became once a week, then once a month. Eventually, it stopped altogether. When I called, his wife would answer, always polite, always distant, saying, "He's working," or "He's tired." At first, I believed her. Then I started noticing how my messages went unread for days, sometimes weeks. I convinced myself he'd come around. He never did. The visits became awkward. When I'd come by, he'd glance at the clock, not out of love, but impatience. His wife would tidy the table before I even finished my tea, as if cleaning up my presence. The home that once smelled of my cooking now smelled like candles and furniture polish, cold and perfect. My photos, once proudly displayed in the living room, were replaced by new ones of vacations and business dinners. I wasn't erased suddenly. I was faded out carefully, like an old picture losing color in the sun. There was a time he asked me to stop calling him at work because it looked unprofessional. I remember hanging up the phone and staring at my reflection in the glass, wondering when I became an inconvenience. I'd raised him to be confident, ambitious, independent. I hadn't realized those same qualities would one day be used to push me out of his life. I told myself he was just busy building his future, but deep down, I knew I wasn't part of that future anymore. It was his wife who first started controlling how much of me he saw. Subtle at first, changing plans, postponing visits, reminding him of boundaries. She once told me I should enjoy my retirement instead of hovering. That word stayed with me, hovering, as if love had become a burden. I started to feel like a guest in my own son's world. The woman I once helped plan their wedding for had turned him into someone who looked at me with duty instead of affection. Birthdays and holidays were the worst. I used to bake him his favorite cake every year, simple, vanilla with buttercream. One year, I sent it over with a small card. It came back unopened, returned with a note from the courier. No longer at this address. He had moved, and no one told me. That was when I realized distance wasn't an accident. It was a choice. He had deliberately built a life where I didn't exist. Still, I never confronted him. I thought maybe silence would fix what words couldn't. I stopped calling, stopped sending gifts. Months passed, and not a single message came. But silence doesn't heal what's deliberate. It only confirms it. I was disappearing from his life, and he didn't even notice. The last time I saw him before that day at the door, he came to collect some papers. He didn't sit. He didn't ask how I was. He just said he was in a hurry. When he left, I saw a stranger, confident, cold, and careful. The same boy who once held my hand crossing the street couldn't even meet my eyes. That moment told me everything I needed to know. The love I gave him had turned into something he used for convenience. When he needed help, he called me Mom. When he didn't, I was just her. I spent years convincing myself I'd done something wrong, that maybe I was too protective, too present. But when someone starts erasing you, it's never about what you did. It's about what they've become. He wanted to move on from his past, and I was part of that past. I just didn't expect him to treat it like something disposable. That slow betrayal hurt more than any argument could. There's no loud ending, no explosion. Just quiet neglect that eats away at you until one day you wake up and realize you're not family anymore. You're just history. And when he finally told me to leave them alone, I realized it wasn't the beginning of his cruelty. It was the final line of a story he'd been writing for years. That night, I couldn't sleep. The words, "Leave us alone," kept replaying in my mind. But something else was louder, a quiet instinct that told me there was more behind his coldness. I had spent my life reading people, sensing truths that were never spoken. This felt different. It wasn't just emotional distance. It was something deliberate, hidden. I got up, turned on the light, and went to the old wooden cabinet where I kept my documents. Things I hadn't looked at in years. Inside was a brown folder marked Property and Loans. I sat down at the table and started going through it. Page after page, there it was. My name beside his on almost every document. The mortgage of his house. The insurance papers. The co-signed bank loan he had promised to close years ago. My name was everywhere, not out of sentiment, but legality. I hadn't just helped him get started. I was still financially bound to his life. He might have thought he'd cut me out emotionally, but on paper, I still existed, everywhere that mattered. As I flipped through the papers, I noticed a small letter from the insurance company, unopened, buried under receipts. It was a payment reminder, overdue for 3 months. The policy was linked to both our names, meaning if he defaulted, I would be responsible. My stomach tightened. He hadn't even told me. I checked the date. The same month he told me to stay out of his life. It was no coincidence. He hadn't just pushed me away. He was using my silence to his advantage. I kept reading, and then I found something worse. A refinancing form, recently stamped, with my forged signature. My handwriting wasn't perfect, but I knew how my name looked. This was different. Practiced. Deliberate. He had extended the mortgage, taken additional credit, and used my identity to secure it. My son, the boy I raised alone, the one who once cried on my shoulder when he couldn't afford school books, had used my name like a shield for his own debts. I sat there for a long time, the clock ticking behind me, the truth slowly settling in. My son hadn't just betrayed me emotionally, he had betrayed me legally. And yet, instead of rage, I felt a strange calm. Maybe because the pain had already reached its limit. There was nothing left to break, only something to fix. Permanently. I gathered every piece of paper into a neat pile. I wasn't just looking at evidence of his deceit. I was looking at my power. The same documents he thought would trap me were the very ones that could free me. My name wasn't just a memory in his life. It was a signature that could undo everything he had built on lies. I remembered how, after his father died, I had promised myself never to depend on anyone again. I became the foundation of this family, steady, invisible, and taken for granted. But that night, under the yellow lamp, I realized something important. Foundations may be silent, but when they move, everything above them shakes. By the time dawn arrived, my decision was made. I didn't cry. I didn't call him. I didn't even tell a friend. Some things are better handled without noise. I placed the documents back into the folder, locked it, and set it beside the phone. The first thing I'd do in the morning was call the one person who understood the language of signatures and ownership, my solicitor. For years, I believed motherhood meant forgiving endlessly. That night, I redefined it. Motherhood, I realized, also meant drawing a line where your love ends and your self-respect begins. When the morning light crept through the curtains, I was already awake. My hands rested on the brown folder beside me, the one that carried every mistake I had made by trusting too easily. The air was still, heavy with something that wasn't anger anymore. It was purpose. I made a cup of tea, set it beside the phone, and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. My solicitor, the same man who once handled my husband's estate. He was surprised to hear from me, but I kept my voice steady. I didn't need sympathy. I needed precision. Within an hour, I was sitting across from him, the folder between us. He opened it slowly, reading every page with the quiet patience of someone who had seen many betrayals, but still respected their weight. When he looked up, I could tell he understood without me saying much. My son's actions weren't just immoral, they were criminal. Forgery, misrepresentation, financial exploitation. But I didn't want revenge. I wanted closure, control, and proof that I was still capable of defending myself. We spent the next few hours going over every document line by line. He showed me where my forged signature appeared, where payments had been redirected, and where my legal rights had been ignored. With each mark of his pen, I felt something inside me straighten, a quiet reclaiming of dignity. I realized that the same papers my son had used to trap me would now set me free. Every dotted line, every notarized stamp, every trace of my name was no longer a burden. It was evidence. He advised immediate steps: file a formal report of forgery, freeze the mortgage account, and issue a legal notice asserting my half-ownership of the property. He explained that as co-signer and guarantor, I had as much right to the house as he did. Perhaps more, since the fraud invalidated his actions. The law, which my son had used like a shield, was now my weapon. I left the office with calm steps, holding copies of the new filings. The papers felt lighter than I expected. Outside, the city moved as usual, cars honking, people rushing, unaware that one quiet woman had just changed the direction of her life. I didn't tell anyone, not even neighbors. The best kind of preparation is the kind done in silence. Back home, I sat at the kitchen table and looked around. Everything suddenly looked different. The chair where my son used to sit, the clock I once bought for him, the quiet room that had become a witness to everything unspoken. For the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. I wasn't the grieving mother or the forgotten parent anymore. I was a woman taking back what was hers. That evening, I wrote a short letter, not to my son, but to myself. I wanted to remember how it felt to stop begging for respect and start demanding it. I wrote, "He told me to leave him alone. Now I will, legally, permanently, and with peace." I folded it neatly and placed it in the same drawer where the property deeds once lay. It wasn't spite. It was documentation of freedom. I called my solicitor again that night to confirm the filings were processed. He assured me they were. By morning, the bank would be notified. The property would be frozen from sale or transfer, and my son would receive a notice he could not ignore. It was strange. I had spent decades speaking softly, never wanting to cause trouble. But now I realized silence wasn't the absence of power. It was the preparation for it. When I hung up, I sat in my chair and watched the clock tick past midnight. Somewhere, he was probably sleeping peacefully, thinking I'd finally listened to him and gone away. I smiled faintly. He'd find out soon enough that a mother's silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes it's the sound right before the storm. Silence spreads faster than words. Within 2 days of filing the papers, my phone started buzzing. Not with calls from my son, but with relatives pretending to check in. They weren't calling out of love. They were fishing for information. Someone had told them I'd done something extreme. That's how families work. When you stay quiet too long, your first act of strength gets called madness. I listened, said little, and let them guess. If they wanted noise, they could make it themselves. I had learned that silence unsettles people more than shouting ever could. By the third day, my niece sent a message saying my son looked stressed at a family gathering. Apparently, the notice from my solicitor had arrived. He had read it, laughed it off, and told everyone I was confused and old-fashioned. They laughed with him, but beneath that laughter, I knew there was fear. He might have dismissed the letter, but he couldn't ignore the name on it. Mine, still legally tied to his property and his finances. He was realizing slowly that the woman he told to leave him alone had just entered his world in a way he couldn't control. I didn't reply to anyone's messages. I didn't explain myself. I went about my days as usual, watering the garden, reading the newspaper, and taking my evening walks. People noticed I seemed calm. They thought I'd given up. They didn't know calmness is what power looks like before it's seen. My solicitor called once, saying my son's lawyer had reached out to clarify the situation. That phrase made me smile. There was nothing to clarify. The law had spoken. Neighbors started whispering too. Some pitied me, saying it was sad to see a family fighting over money. They didn't know this wasn't about money. It was about dignity. When you grow old, people assume you've lost your ability to defend yourself. They confuse silence for weakness, trust for blindness. I wasn't weak, and I wasn't blind. I was patient. And patience is a skill my generation perfected long before theirs learned how to lie with smiles. A week later, the whispers reached my son's workplace. A mutual acquaintance, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, called to tell me he looked pale and nervous when people brought up the topic. Apparently, he had told his colleagues that it's just a misunderstanding. But misunderstandings don't come with court seals and legal filings. He was cornered by his own carelessness. The same arrogance that told me to stay out of his life was now eating him alive in public. Still, I didn't celebrate. There's no joy in watching your own child fall. But there is relief, the kind that comes when justice begins to move, slow but sure. I spent my evenings sitting by the window, sipping tea, thinking about how easy it had been for him to erase me emotionally, but how impossible it was to erase me legally. Paper doesn't forget what hearts do. Relatives kept trying to mediate, urging me to drop it. They said things like, "He's your only son," or "Families shouldn't take each other to court." I asked none of them where they were when I was being erased. No one had stood up for me then. Now that consequences had arrived, suddenly everyone remembered morality. That's how family morality works. It always shows up when it's convenient. I learned something valuable during that quiet week. People don't like seeing an elderly woman in control. They'd rather see her broken, crying, apologizing for existing. But when she sits straight, files her own papers, and doesn't explain herself, she becomes something they don't know how to talk about. Untouchable. As the days went on, my son's silence grew louder than the gossip. No calls, no letters, no visits. The absence didn't hurt anymore. It felt earned. I had spent years begging for words, and now I realized that silence, when chosen, can be more powerful than any conversation. The courthouse smelled of dust, coffee, and quiet tension. I sat on the wooden bench near the front, hands folded neatly in my lap, that same brown folder resting beside me. I wasn't nervous. Not anymore. I had already lived through worse storms than this. Silence, betrayal, humiliation. Courtrooms, at least, deal in facts. The heart doesn't get that luxury. Across the room, my son sat beside his wife, whispering to their lawyer. His posture was confident, almost rehearsed. He thought this was going to be a formality, an old woman's last attempt to feel relevant. He had no idea what was coming. When the judge entered, everyone rose. My solicitor stood, calm and sharp, his briefcase heavy with proof. The proceedings began with routine questions, verification, statements, procedural formality. My son's lawyer was smooth, dismissive. He spoke about family misunderstandings and emotional strain. Every word was calculated to make me look fragile, senile, and overly emotional. I didn't interrupt. I let them build that image. It's easier to dismantle something when people underestimate its weight. Then my solicitor stood. He placed one single document on the judge's desk, the refinancing form with the forged signature. The room went quiet. He explained how my son had extended a mortgage under my name, how my signature had been copied without consent, and how the bank's internal report confirmed the handwriting didn't match mine. The judge asked for the bank representative, who had been quietly waiting outside. When he stepped forward, I saw my son's shoulders stiffen for the first time. The bank manager confirmed everything. He explained that the transaction had raised a minor concern at the time, but was approved because the names matched, mine and my son's. Now, under scrutiny, it was clear. Fraud. The judge's expression didn't change, but I saw his pen pause mid-note. That pause was everything. It meant the truth was landing exactly where it needed to. Then, the notary entered, another man I had quietly asked my solicitor to bring. He confirmed witnessing my husband's original property signing years ago. He also verified that all authentic documents under my name carried a different signature pattern than the forged ones. The pieces were falling perfectly into place. My son shifted in his seat, his face losing its color. His wife whispered something, but he didn't answer. The same man who once told me to stay out of his life was now trapped inside a truth he couldn't escape. When my turn came, I stood slowly, steady on my cane. The judge asked if I wished to add anything. I simply said that all I ever wanted was respect, not control. That I had spent my life building a home, not a battlefield. That I had never raised a hand to my son, only hopes. And when those hopes turned to betrayal, I turned to the law. Not for revenge, but for peace. My voice didn't shake. I didn't look at him. There was no need. The court went quiet for a moment longer. Even his lawyer stopped speaking. There's a kind of silence that only truth can bring. Heavy, undeniable, final. The judge adjourned for a short break, and as people stood, I caught sight of my son's face. He wasn't angry anymore. He looked small, cornered by his own arrogance. His wife avoided my eyes completely. I didn't gloat. There's no joy in watching your own blood shrink in shame, but there is justice in it. Quiet, honest justice. When the judge returned, his verdict was brief. The documents were fraudulent, the financial misuse proven, and my ownership rights reinstated. Everything my son had tried to take from me was restored. Legally, cleanly, permanently. The courtroom murmured softly, a mix of surprise and discomfort. My son didn't move. His wife stared at the floor. My solicitor packed the folder, nodded at me, and whispered, "It's done." I walked out of the courtroom without looking back. The air outside felt lighter, colder, cleaner. I took a slow breath, steady and full. After years of being dismissed, my truth had finally been recorded. In writing, under law, signed by authority. He told me to leave him alone. I did. But I left him alone with the truth. And that's a company no liar enjoys. When the judge began to read the decision, the entire courtroom seemed to shrink around his voice. The sound was calm, measured, and heavy with finality. There were no outbursts, no dramatic moments, just the quiet weight of truth finding its place in law. He declared that the forged documents were invalid, that the transfer of property was unlawful, and that I remained the rightful co-owner of the estate. He ordered my son to repay the funds he had withdrawn using my name, plus damages for emotional distress and misuse of power of attorney. Every word landed like the slow ticking of a clock, marking the end of something long overdue. I didn't move. I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap, while my solicitor nodded with satisfaction beside me. My son, on the other hand, seemed to stop breathing. His face went pale, his eyes darting between the judge, his lawyer, and me, as if searching for someone to save him. His wife's expression was blank, frozen in disbelief. They had both built their comfort on my silence, and now that silence had turned into evidence. When the judge finished, he looked directly at me and said, "I had every right to protect what I had built." It was a simple statement, but it was more validation than I had heard in years. I didn't smile or cry. I just nodded. There was no victory dance in justice, just peace. The court clerk handed me a stamped copy of the ruling, thick and official, my name once again printed where it had always belonged. My hands trembled slightly as I took it, not from fear, but from the realization that I had reclaimed something far more important than property. I had reclaimed my place. My son tried to speak, but the judge silenced him with a glance. The law doesn't care for explanations after the verdict. His lawyer whispered something to him, maybe a plan for appeal, but even that sounded hollow. You can't appeal against the truth. When the hearing ended, I stood slowly, using my cane for balance. My solicitor offered his arm, but I refused. I had walked into this courtroom alone, and I would walk out the same way. Not as a victim, but as a woman who remembered her worth. Outside, the corridor was filled with murmurs. Lawyers discussing the case, strangers glancing at me, curious about the quiet old woman who had just won against her own child. I heard someone say, "She didn't even raise her voice." They were right. I hadn't needed to. Justice doesn't always come in shouts. Sometimes it arrives in signatures, sealed with the weight of every sleepless night you've endured in silence. When I stepped into the sunlight, I paused for a moment on the courthouse steps. The breeze felt different, lighter, cleaner. My son walked past me without a word, his head lowered, his wife trailing behind him. I didn't watch them go. I didn't want to. My story with them had already been written, stamped, and closed by a judge's gavel. There was nothing left to say. In the taxi home, I held the verdict papers close, like a fragile truth that had finally survived everything meant to destroy it. I thought about the years of sacrifice, the loneliness, the heartbreak, the endless patience that had brought me here. For so long, I had believed that love meant forgiveness. But now I knew. Sometimes love means holding someone accountable, even if they share your blood. When I reached home, I placed the documents on my table and poured myself a cup of tea. The same table where I had once signed papers out of trust now held proof that trust without respect is a trap. I didn't feel triumphant or bitter, just calm. The kind of calm that comes when justice speaks softly, yet completely. He had told me, "Please, just leave us alone." And I had. I left him with the truth, with consequences, with silence. The kind of silence that doesn't beg, it teaches. The weeks that followed felt like a long exhale after years of holding my breath. The noise was gone. No more phone calls filled with excuses. No more messages twisting guilt into conversation. The house was silent, but for the first time, it wasn't lonely. It was mine again. The papers from the court sat neatly in a drawer, a quiet reminder that peace sometimes wears the face of paperwork. I didn't celebrate. I didn't announce victory. I simply began to live again. Slowly, carefully, and without the need to explain myself to anyone. A letter arrived one morning. A plain envelope, handwriting I knew instantly. It was from my son. No greeting, no apology, just 10 short lines about regret and misunderstanding. He didn't sign his name. It was strange how a person could have so much to say and yet say nothing real. I read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it inside the verdict envelope. Not out of anger, but because I had no desire to erase evidence of either, his cruelty or his attempt to take it back. Both belonged to the same story, and I had accepted all of it. I spent those weeks rearranging my life in small, practical ways. I called a real estate agent and listed my half of the property. The money that came in wasn't wealth. It was closure. I bought a small cottage near the sea, a quiet place where no one shouted and no one owed anyone anything. The first night I slept there, the sound of the waves outside reminded me of breathing. Steady, honest, alive. It was the first peaceful night I'd had in years. Friends visited sometimes. They asked how I was, and I told them I was fine. Some pressed for details, wanting gossip, but I didn't feed them. The story was finished. They couldn't understand how calm I felt. They still lived in a world where winning meant noise, confrontation, and spectacle. I lived in a world where winning meant stillness, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself anymore. Occasionally, I'd see my son's name mentioned by relatives, usually in whispers. Some said he was struggling. Others said he had changed jobs, trying to rebuild his reputation. I didn't ask. Healing doesn't mean watching the wound reopen elsewhere. I wished him peace from afar. Nothing more, nothing less. I wasn't bitter, just distant. Distance was safer. It was how I made sure history didn't repeat itself. I started volunteering twice a week, helping elderly women file for pensions, property rights, and small legal claims. Many of them were like me, women who had trusted too much, spoken too softly, and signed papers they didn't understand. I showed them how to protect what was theirs, not out of vengeance, but out of duty. I had learned that justice, once found, must be shared. That work gave my pain a purpose. Every time I saw one of them walk away a little more confident, I felt lighter. Sometimes, I sit by the window in the evening with tea and think about how easily life can turn, how someone you raised can turn into someone who erases you. But then I remember the courtroom, the verdict, and the silence that followed. That silence wasn't emptiness, it was strength. It was proof that even quiet people can make the loudest impact when they finally stop explaining and start acting. Now the days pass slowly. I watch the sea change colors from blue to silver to black. I keep the documents safe in a box, not out of fear, but as a record of survival. The law didn't just restore my rights. It reminded me that dignity doesn't need permission to exist. He once told me to leave him alone. I did. I left him alone with the truth, the weight of his choices, and the echo of his own words. And I walked away with something far more powerful, peace that he can never take back. Now that time has passed, I often sit by my window in the cottage, watching the waves move in slow rhythm, steady and endless. The sea has become my clock, each tide a reminder that even the deepest wounds can settle when left alone. I think back to that moment at his door, when my son looked at me and said, "Please, just leave us alone." He said it like a command, but I took it as permission. Permission to stop carrying the burden of being needed only for convenience. That sentence, cold as it was, set me free. I don't feel anger anymore. Anger burns too fast to last this long. What remains is understanding. A hard, quiet understanding that love cannot survive where respect has died. I raised him with every part of me. I gave him education, comfort, and the home that built his confidence. But I also taught him, without meaning to, that I would always forgive. That was my mistake. Forgiveness should be earned, not assumed. When people ask how I found the strength to face my own child in court, I tell them strength doesn't come from courage. It comes from exhaustion. It comes when you have been silent for so long that silence itself becomes your weapon. I didn't fight him out of hate. I fought to remind myself that I still existed, that the years I spent building, teaching, and surviving meant something. Justice wasn't revenge. It was remembrance. The day I left the courthouse, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clean. Clean from manipulation, clean from guilt, clean from the lies that had disguised themselves as family duty. I walked away not as a mother abandoned, but as a woman reclaimed. The world may see old age as weakness, but I've learned that survival gives you a kind of power that youth can't understand. You stop fearing endings because you've already lived through enough of them. Sometimes, in the quiet evenings, I still think about the boy he once was. The one who used to hold my hand while crossing the street, who'd ask for one more story before bed. I try to remember him that way, because that's the son I loved. The man he became is his own making, shaped by choices that were never mine to control. A mother can only guide. She cannot guarantee. But when that guidance turns into disregard, when kindness is mistaken for weakness, the lesson changes. I kept every paper from the case, the verdict, the signatures, even the stamped court seal. Not because I need proof anymore, but because it reminds me that silence isn't submission. It's strategy. Those pages are the story of how a woman who was told to stay quiet finally spoke in the only language her betrayers respected, the language of consequence. Now the house is filled with small routines that belong only to me. I wake with the sunrise, make my tea, water the plants, and walk along the shore. The mornings are soft, and the nights are peaceful. There's no noise, no accusations, no false apologies. Just quiet, the kind that heals instead of hides. Sometimes neighbors ask if I miss my son. I always answer honestly. I miss who he used to be, not who he chose to become. That difference matters. It's what allows me to move forward without bitterness. I've learned that forgiveness isn't about letting people back in. It's about letting pain go without taking you with it. He asked me to leave him alone, and I did. But I also left him a lesson that neglect comes with cost, and respect, once lost, doesn't return on demand. I hope one day he understands that I didn't go to court to destroy him. I went to remind him that even mothers have limits, and that love without boundaries is just servitude disguised as care. So now, as I look into the fading light beyond my window, I whisper to whoever needs to hear it. When someone you love tells you to disappear, don't vanish. Stand still until they see the space they created. Because sometimes, silence is not surrender. It's the sound of someone remembering their worth,